Greetings! This is the second video regarding job order costing. Here we will apply what we have learned in the first video towards completing 3 problems in the textbook. These concepts can be found on pages 172 to 229 of the textbook, and exercises can be found on pages 210 to 229. If you desire to review the concepts discussed in this chapter, pages 204 to 209 are very useful. The first problem that we will be completing will be exercise 5-22 on page 213 of the textbook, and we will be completing all the parts or parts 1 and 2. This reads, at the beginning of the year, Oberg Company estimated the following costs: overhead $416,000 and direct labor costs $520,000. Oberg uses normal costing and applies overhead on the basis of direct labor costs. Direct labor costs is equal to total direct labor hours worked multiplied by the wage rate. For the month of December, direct labor costs was $43,700. When completing this problem, if you remember from the previous video, predetermined overhead is equal to estimated annual overhead divided by estimated annual activity level. In this case, the annual activity level is direct labor cost. And also, for part 2, when doing the overhead applied or applied overhead is equal to predetermined overhead rate times actual activity level. Notably, when completing part 2, I use the answer from part 1 multiplied by the December rate. For clarity's sake, I put in a box to highlight the givens for this problem, which were considered to be first, overhead, second, direct labor costs, and the direct labor costs for September. Also, I used the highlighter with the solutions under predetermined overhead for the answer of part 1 and part 2 overhead applied for December. This spreadsheet is considered to be not as much a professional accounting spreadsheet. This is more, my purpose of doing this is to be able to help the learner better understand how to complete this problem. However, I use the standard who, what, and when conducting the spreadsheet. In this problem, I use the concepts learned in this class. For part 1, you're supposed to calculate the predetermined overhead, which I use the estimated annual overhead, which is right here, a given, and divided by the estimated annual activity level, which is the direct labor cost. So you divide the two and you get 0.8 per direct labor hour. In part 2, where you're calculating the applied overhead, you're already given the direct labor costs for September. So applied overhead is equal to predetermined overhead rate, which is right here, times actual activity level. For December, the actual activity level is 43,700. And if you notice, if you think about it, it seems pretty reasonable, December versus the direct labor cost. So right here, applied overhead December is equal to predetermined overhead times the direct labor costs for September, and you get applied overhead for December. Next, we will delve into another problem, which will deal with the concept of overhead variance. The second problem that we will tackle will be exercise 5-23 on page 213 of the textbook, and we will be completing parts 1 and 2. This reads, at the end of the year, Oberg Company provided the following actual information: overhead $423,600. Direct labor costs, $532,000. Oberg uses normal costing and applies overhead at the rate of 80% of direct labor costs. At the end of the year, cost of goods sold before adjusting for any overhead variance was $1,890,000. Calculate the overhead variance for the year and dispose the overhead variance by adjusting the cost of goods sold. When solving this problem, I considered the calculation for overhead variance, where overhead variance equals actual overhead minus applied overhead. Also, notably for part 2, where you dispose of the variance by adjusting cost of goods sold, you utilize the cost of goods sold, which is given in this formula. However, you're trying to make it the adjusted cost of goods sold, which is plus or minus the different type of variance. Therefore, making the adjusted cost of goods sold. Adjusted cost of goods sold is equal to the unadjusted cost of goods sold less over-applied overhead plus under-applied overhead to get the solution. When completing this problem, I made sure to highlight the givens, which is the overhead, which is $423,600, and direct labor cost, which is $532,000. Also, I highlight the other given, which is the cost of goods sold, which is $1,890,000, and all the givens were highlighted in a box. Also, the solutions for both part 1 and part 2 were highlighted in yellow for clarity's sake. This second problem involving Oberg Company, I used the same format at the top for the who, what, and when. This is, once again, this problem is less accounting formatted as more concept formatted. Therefore, I tried to make it as clear as possible in order to help new learners solve this problem. On the next page, I will show you the exercise and how I found the solution in Excel. For this problem, notably I used the who, Oberg Company again, the what, job order costing sheet, and the when for the year ending December 31st, 2015. Also, when calculating part 1, which is the overhead variance, I use the actual overhead, yet I calculated the applied overhead based in the given that it was 80% of direct labor costs. The direct labor cost is $532,000. So I multiplied, in order to get the applied overhead, 80% or 0.8 times the direct labor cost to get applied overhead. To calculate the overhead variance, you have to have the actual overhead less the applied overhead, which is the actual $423,600 and the applied overhead, which is $425,600. The overhead variance was negative $2,000, therefore it was $2,000 over applied. In order to complete part 2, which is to get the dispose of the overhead variance to get the adjusted cost of goods sold, I use the given cost of goods sold right here. So right here is the given cost of goods sold, and I left the over applied because it's overhead. So the over applied overhead is a total of this or 2,000, which brings the answer right here. The answer is a total of $1,888,000. The final problem that we will be completing will be exercise 5-51 on page 224 of the textbook, and we will be completing part 1 only. This reads, suppose that back in the 1970s, Steve was asked to build speakers for 2 friends. The first friend, Jan, needed a speaker for her band. The second friend, Ed, needed a speaker built into the back of his hatchback automobile. Steve figured out the following costs for each. For materials for Jen's job, $50. For Ed's job, $75. Labor hours, Jan's $10. Ed's job, $20. Steve knew that Jan's job would be easier since he had experience in building the type of speakers she needed. Her job would not require any special equipment or specialized fitting. Ed's job, on the other hand, required specialized design and precise fitting. Steve thought he might need to build a mock-up of the speaker first to fit it into the space. In addition, he might have to add to his tool collection to complete the job. Normally, Steve figured a wage rate of $6 per hour and charged 20% of labor and materials as an overhead rate. Part 1. Prepare job order cost sheets for the two jobs showing total cost. In this problem, obviously I used the who, what, and the when. However, there's no really given company, so I made the name Steve's Speaker because Steve was building a speaker for his friends. And because you don't know the year, I did the year 1975 because it was in the old era of the 1970s right here. However, when being able to solve the problem for part 1, I used the $6 per hour in order times the labor hours for both Jan's and Ed's jobs respectively in order to get the direct labor cost. For overhead, I did 20% or 0.2 times the total of what I got for the direct labor costs plus materials, since he figured a wage rate of $6 per hour, which calculated the direct labor costs. However, it's 20% of that and materials, which is materials right here, and direct labor costs. I highlighted the two new concepts, or the two new things I added in the spreadsheet in yellow, which was the direct labor cost and the overhead, which were omitted from this right here. And also, I highlighted in blue the original and part 1 so you could see the comparison and get the total cost for the job order cost sheets right here. Originally, for this problem, I did the who, the what, and the when, as I mentioned earlier. However, the original problem shows materials and labor hours. However, when calculating a total cost, you must omit the labor hours because it's not in money and it's a bit confusing to add labor, to put the labor hours there because you're not adding them to get the total cost. Also, I had the overhead, which was 20% of materials and direct labor, so I did 0.2 times the sum of these two. Also, direct labor cost is 6 times the labor hours, so 6 times 10, 60, and 6 times 20 is 120. So the total cost is equal to materials plus direct labor plus overhead for both Jan's job, which is $132 bottom line, and Ed's job, which is $234, so the job order cost sheet. And you know, that's it. This concludes our second and final Chapter 5 video on job order costing, and the next video will be the first Chapter 6 video on process costing regarding concepts, definitions, and equations. Resources can be used at ACE and both the Bedford and Lowell Math Centers as well as e-tutoring. Thank you for watching and please stay tuned.